Friends, today is Transfiguration Sunday, as you probably have already gathered. It's a bit odd because it's not actually the Feast of the Transfiguration. The Feast of the Transfiguration is usually celebrated on the 6th of August, so much later in the year. But oddly, the readings that speak to the events of the Transfiguration appear on this day in our lectionary. And so we end up calling this Transfiguration Sunday and end up reflecting on the events of the Transfiguration. You may know that the provincial seminary in Grahamstown is named after this event, the College of the Transfiguration. And if I'm not mistaken, I think perhaps the late Arch Desmond Tutu might have chosen that name, I'm not sure. But in any event, having spent a year at the college, I suppose, just as when you have a church with a certain nomenclature, like All Saints, you kind of reflect on the name from time to time. And what does it mean that you are a member of this church, which is named All Saints? So we were led to reflect on the Transfiguration and its significance, and it's something that I've kind of struggled with to try and get to the theological meaning and significance of these events. You know, it's unlike, or perhaps in the case of the resurrection or the crucifixion or the incarnation, the birth of Christ, the import seems to be more obvious. But when it comes to the Feast of the Transfiguration, what really is its significance for us? What is its significance for us? And what really happens to Jesus on that mountain? Is it just an apparition that appears before Peter, James, and John? Or is his appearance really physically changed? And I don't know if we're going to arrive at any concrete answers today, but just in exploring some of these themes, I thought we might consider in conjunction the notion of transfiguration and testimony. Transfiguration and testimony. And I don't know if you can recall, well, last time I was here, I walked around a bit, but you're filming, right? So I must stay at the lectern, I think. We were reflecting on Psalm 40, and one of the things that I asked was how often, because it says, tell of God's glorious deeds amidst the congregation, and I asked the question, how often do we share what God has achieved and accomplished in our lives with those around us, not just in the church, but perhaps in our workplaces as well? And so maybe in continuing from that, in that train of thought, I was hoping to look at the idea of transfiguration and testimony today. Because if you look at the New Testament reading from 2 Peter, and it's interesting because, did you notice at the end of the gospel reading, and we're going to look at the gospel reading in a little bit more detail, but right at the end, they've just had this amazing experience, this amazing revelation and epiphany of who Jesus is, and what does Jesus say? Don't tell anyone. Strange. Well, at least he says, don't tell anyone until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. There's often like the secretiveness about Jesus and about the proclamation that he's entrusting to his disciples prior to his crucifixion and resurrection. But interestingly, by the time of 2 Peter, what is Peter doing? He's actually using the events that occurred on the mountain to validate his testimony. He's using it to validate and to back up his testimony, saying that we were eyewitnesses of God's glory on that mountain, right? And this is what I think, brothers and sisters, is that when we have an encounter, and a meaningful encounter with Christ, we are changed, we are transformed, and we become new people. And from that, automatically, we have to give testimony in some way, shape, or form. So interestingly, we had a quiet day yesterday at St. Michael's, and we were reflecting on, okay, well, let me start with this. It's a little bit of biblical trivia. Who is the first evangelist? Because we're talking about testimony, we're talking about encounters with Christ, and we're talking about giving testimony on the basis of that. So who is the first evangelist recorded in the Bible? Supposedly. Maybe it's debatable. Does anyone know? Any ideas? The shepherds? Yeah, at the birth of Christ. You see, this is why it's debatable. That was you, Heather. Some other people have said that it was the Samaritan woman. Because early on in John's Gospel, John chapter 4, she has this encounter with Christ, and she then immediately goes off to the villagers, to the townsfolk, and saying to them, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done." And we read ultimately at the end of that passage that many people were brought to faith in Christ. So she was evangelizing, actively evangelizing. Do you know what is another bit of biblical trivia? Do you know what is the single longest conversation that Jesus has with one individual? You probably already know the answer because I've already referred to it. The 40 days in the wilderness, okay, so with the devil. So he has this long spats of dialogue where he's teaching, which far exceed what I'm referring to. But what I'm referring to is a one-on-one conversation with a person. It's the Samaritan woman. The single longest conversation recorded in the Bible that Jesus has with one individual is a Samaritan woman. So this is very interesting and very instructive because he doesn't have the single longest conversation with Herod. He doesn't have a single longest conversation with Pontius Pilate. He doesn't have a single longest conversation, not even with Nicodemus, which is a pretty long conversation. He has it with this obscure outcast of a person, the Samaritan woman, who has been alienated from her community by virtue of the fact that she's had 5 husbands and the husband she's currently living with she's not married to him. Right? But she has this fundamentally changing, transformative encounter with Christ, and on the basis of that encounter alone, she can't help herself. Remember, why does she go to the well at 12? She goes to the well at 12, there's nobody else there. Why would she do that? What time of the day do you go to the well? You go in the early morning or in the evening, when it's nice and cool. And all the women in the village do that, and it's like a little social event, a little social gathering where you can get some skinnering done about what's happening in the community, right? But because she feels alienated, because she is alienated and ostracized for whatever reason, we don't know for a fact that it's because she's had 5 husbands. For whatever reason, she's alienated. And that's why she goes at 12 o'clock midday when the sun is highest and it's scorchingly hot. But she has this chance encounter with Christ, which changes her in a radical way, such that the first thing she does, she goes back into the community. She no longer cares about what people think of her, but proclaims boldly and proudly, "Come and see a man who has told me everything I've ever done," and brings many people to faith. So there are these encounters, there are these situations which are life-changing and transformative, and seemingly in a good way. But there are also other times, brothers and sisters, and this is what I want to finish up in terms of focusing on. And I hope I'm going to be able to convey or communicate this effectively. But perhaps I'm suggesting that you just take notice of some of the details. And here I'm reading another account of the Transfiguration, but from Luke's Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts, they differ slightly. The substance is more or less the same, but I just prefer Luke's version of the account of the Transfiguration. And it says from verse 32 in Luke chapter 9, "Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him." But remember, why does Peter say Peter's flabbergasted and bewildered and confused, and he's just babbling, right? That's the impression that we get. So he doesn't know what to say. He just says something, and he says, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let us make one shelter for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Not knowing what he said, but while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." So brothers and sisters, Oftentimes when we have encounters with God, meaningful encounters which fundamentally change us, it's not always in a pleasant way, right? It's not always a bed of roses, but sometimes you may find that a cloud will overshadow you such that you become disorientated, you cannot see, you don't know where you're going, you become fearful and scared. And out of that cloud, God's voice says, gives you a revelation. You are my child, my beloved. With you I am well pleased. Notice that in the Exodus narrative as well, it is from within the cloud that the voice of God comes. I want to just give you another example. Genesis chapter 15. This is probably one of the single most important promises that God makes in the context of the biblical narrative, right? This is the Abrahamic covenant, where God promises Abraham, though Sarah is barren and childless, he promises Abraham, he says, look up to the heavens. Do you see the stars? So shall your descendants be. They will be as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. And he promises them the land that they subsequently inherit. So this promise is of utmost value, and to this day, from a theological point of view, is part of the justification for the nation-state of Israel and for their possession of that land. That's why I say there's scarcely a promise in the context of the Bible that is more important, right? But now I want you to take note, brothers and sisters, because you are waiting to be in a broad and pleasant place. And then you're expecting that God is going to speak to you in that broad and pleasant place. And what I'm saying to you is that doesn't always happen. Sometimes God speaks to you when you're at your lowest. And you don't even realize it. Maybe you only realize it later, or you only realize it in hindsight. But the promise is still there. The revelation is still there. Now, God has just promised Abraham the world. He has promised him his descendants to be more numerous than the stars in the sky, more numerous than the grains of sand on the seashore. And Abraham's like, cool, God, now I can just get some rest and go to sleep. And that's what he does. And guess what happens? Guess what happens? Chapter 15, verse 12. As the sun was going down, and God has just promised Abraham the world, a deep sleep fell upon him, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. A deep and terrifying darkness descended upon Abraham. Was the darkness evil? Was the darkness bad? I'm not sure. But from within the darkness, the Lord says to Abraham, I've promised you the world. I've promised that your descendants will be infinitely numerous. But know this for certain, that your offspring shall also be aliens in a land that is not theirs. And they shall be slaves for a time, and they shall be oppressed for 100 years. And yet I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. So within the promise of blessing, there is also a guarantee of adversity, brothers and sisters. So as we continue to contemplate these things, as we continue to contemplate the significance of the transfiguration in our own lives, I pray, my sincere prayer for each one of you, is that you will encounter Christ, whether through good times or bad times, and that by virtue of that encounter, you will be changed and transformed, such that you cannot help but testify to the goodness and faithfulness of God.